All right, three, two, one. Hey, folks, we've got another episode of the Bulwarg Disclosure Podcast here. We're going to talk to somebody today that I really have a lot of respect for. You know, anybody who uses their position in life and the things that they've seen to expose injustices or evil is someone that I really have a great deal of respect for. And today we are joined by someone who that applies to more than anybody else I can think of. We have Mr. John Kiriakou here. Thanks for
Hey, how are
joining us,
you?
John.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
For anybody who doesn't know, John is an author and other things, but probably most famously known for, being a very famous CIA defector. And John is actually the one who exposed the enhanced interrogation techniques that were being used, during the Iraq War. He has the unique honor of being the only person ever prosecuted over the CIA's enhanced interrogation programs, and not for participating in them, but for exposing them.
Yeah, I'm the only one. After all these years, you would have thought that somebody at some point would have been prosecuted, and never.
Yeah.
They all went on to great riches with multi-million dollar book advances.
And you actually spent some time in prison for uh,
Yeah, I spent 23 months in a federal prison for for my revelations, and I was facing 45 years. I ended up having to take a plea. I have 5 kids, and just to make the sentence as short as possible. But that hasn't stopped the FBI from raiding my house even after I got out of prison. It's it's contentious. Yeah.
What was it like after you got out of prison? You were, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were technically a felon after this.
Oh yeah,
What
I'm
was it
very
like?
much a felon. Yeah, it's funny. In some ways, it's liberating, I guess is the word that I could use. It has opened up a new world to me that I would never have had exposure to.
Hmm.
There's this joke that everybody in prison is innocent, right? The truth is, there are a lot of people in prison who are innocent. This has become a real issue for me. According to ProPublica, the government wins 98.2% of its cases. Almost all of those 98.2% wins are a result of plea bargains. Well, when you have, 20, 30, 50 years hanging over your head, and they say, look, we'll dismiss all the charges but one. If you just take a plea to this one felony, and
Hmm.
then you do a year or two, you're going to take the deal. Even if you're innocent, you're going to take the deal because you can't roll those dice knowing that they have a 98.2% chance of winning. In fact, I told my lawyers at one point, look, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm going to trial. And one of the lawyers said, think of it this way. Every time you walk into a room, you flip on the light switch. Would you go into the room and flip on the light switch if you know that 98.2% of the time it's going to electrocute you? No. He says, take the deal. And so I took the deal. And that's what most everybody does.
What did that feel like after you got out of prison? I assume it kind of precluded you from ever working in the same area that you did before in
Oh,
government.
yeah.
What was your mindset? What were you even looking to do after that?
Yeah, that's an important point, and it's not just unique to me. It's everybody who's been in prison
Hmm.
experiences the same thing. I'm lucky because I've got a master's degree and I've got 25 years of white collar experience.
Hmm.
I was one of the government's leading experts in the Middle East, so I could build something, but I could never work for government again. I could never get a corporate job again. I
Right.
could never get a security clearance again. So I had to make something for myself.
Right.
So I started at a think tank. It was the Institute for Policy Studies, the oldest left wing think tank in Washington.
Hmm.
So they gave me a job as soon as I got out, and it wasn't, I wasn't going on to like greatness or anything. It was a minimum wage job to write a syndicated column. So I did that until I could find something better. I got a radio show that led to another syndicated column that led to a TV show. And now I've actually patched together a decent living. But again, I'm unique. What if you've done 5 years or 10 years on a drug charge, mm-hmm. and there are no like training courses in prison. They're not going to teach you plumbing or electrical work or mechanical work or anything. So you get out of prison and you go back to your neighborhood with what skills? The only thing you know how to do is sell drugs. And so you're going to sell drugs again. And then we sit there and we wonder, like, why is our recidivism rate so high? Mm-hmm. It's because we prepare people for failure in our system.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say to other people, who maybe were working somewhere in government or somewhere where, they were privy to the types of things that you were, and they're unsure about, coming forward with those types of things? What would you say to those people, having that experience?
Yeah, that's a good question too. You have to come forward. You absolutely have to come forward. You won't be able to live with yourself if you don't. Mm-hmm. But don't do it the way I did it. I went straight to the media. First, get the best whistleblower protection attorney that you possibly can. Mm-hmm. Don't say a word unless that attorney is sitting next to you. And then with the attorney, go to the oversight committees. And then if the oversight committees don't give you satisfaction, then you go to the media with the attorney. But you've got to, I was reactive in that I had to hire an attorney after I blew the whistle. I would encourage everybody to hire the attorney first and then blow the whistle.
It's a very bleak thing, because if you think about the high profile cases of whistleblowers, whether it's Julian Assange or Snowden or, people like Gary Webb, people are very disincentivized to come forward.
Yeah. Listen, there are no good stories here. There are no good outcomes.
Right.
You remember in Kill the Messenger, Gary Webb, the movie ended with Gary mm-hmm. Webb putting a gun in his mouth in a motel in Colorado. Mm-hmm. I'll give you another example that you may not know of Tom Drake at NSA. Tom was an Air Force colonel and then joined NSA on the morning of September 11th, 2001 as a senior intelligence service officer. Mm-hmm. As soon as 9/11 took place, NSA implemented a plan to begin intercepting the communications of Americans. Mm-hmm. That is patently illegal. Mm-hmm. It's not just illegal. It's also prohibited in NSA's charter. So he did it the right way. He went to the Inspector General. The Inspector General was not read into the program, told him, I don't know what you're talking about. Then he went to the General Counsel. They said, buddy, this is over your head. You need to shut your mouth. Then he went to the Pentagon Inspector General, who actually ratted him out to the FBI. Then he went to the Congressional Oversight Committees. So everybody he spoke to was cleared for the information. Yet they charged him with 9 felonies, including 7 counts of espionage and 2 counts of theft of government property, with the property being the information that he walked out of the building with in his head. Now, the case ended up falling apart, but not before he lost his pension, his job, his security clearance, his wife, and he ended up working the rest of his career in an Apple store in Bethesda, Maryland.
Incredible. It reminds, just the good guys ending up taking the brunt of the wrath of the government. It reminds me of the Franklin scandal. And I don't know if you're familiar with John DeCamp and, yes. Or the case of Gary Caradori, who was also kind of working on this whistleblower level and died in a plane accident with his son,
Yes.
And obviously that whole thing was investigating, a trafficking network that kind of has parallels with things like Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Do you think there are some cases or some topics that it's just impossible for justice or truth to ever see the light of day?
I hate to say this, but I think that's most cases involving national security organs. Mm-hmm. Yes. I gave a speech at American University several years ago, and I used a hypothetical situation, but it for some reason took on a life of its own. I said, Part of the problem with the CIA is there is no training whatsoever in ethics, right? You have to go in there with your own set of moral values, of ethical guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, and again, this is purely from my own imagination, but it's true to life. I said, let's say you're a CIA case officer in the Middle East, and you have recruited a bona fide terrorist, somebody from al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
You meet with this guy once a month in a hotel, let's say in Cairo or Amman, and the information he has given you has been 100% accurate. And that information you have used to disrupt attacks and save American lives. So this guy's the real deal. Then you go to meet him one day, and he says to you, you know, I've been good to you, and everything I've given you is true. So now you're going to do something for me. You're going to get me a prostitute. And if you don't get me a prostitute, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. So I ask the crowd, do you get him the prostitute? Show of hands. And usually about 90% of the hands go up. And I say, yeah, you get him the prostitute. It's ugly. It's dirty. But this is the job we've chosen, right? And you want your source to be happy. What if he asks you for a child prostitute? And people kind of look around to see what their neighbors are going to do. And then like a 10th put their hand in the air. And I say, absolutely not. Look, we all want to serve our country in one way or the other. We can't lose our humanity. It's a child, for God's sake. Now, the problem is there are no rules. Your job as a CIA case officer is to break the law in whatever country you happen to be serving in. Your job is to collect information to supply to the government so that our elected leaders can make policy. So there's no rule that says, hey, man, you can't get a child prostitute. And so some do, or some would. And that leads to situations like we saw with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and a whole host of other people who have no right to live in civilized society.
Yeah. I think that's what's really hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. They're used to the idea of intelligence agency that's been purported by Hollywood and Tom Clancy and stuff for so long. It's hard for them to understand that there are people out there that would do that will do whatever it takes to, in their minds, serve their country or whatever.
Yes.
So that's it kind of brings me to something I wanted to talk to you about. There's a couple things just going on right now, at the time that we're recording this, that I'd love to talk to you about. And one of them is Donald Trump and the assassination attempts. For the most part, I tend to believe that if an intelligence agency wants somebody dead, they're going to die.
Yeah, they're going to be in the ground.
Right.
Yeah.
And with some of the things we've been touching on, blackmail and things of that nature, I think people don't realize that there's quite a bit of that in Trump's history, and people look at him as this guy, drain the swamp and, going to end the deep state and stuff. But Trump had very much his opportunity to end the deep state. He appointed Gina Haspel to the CIA. There's a million
John
things.
Bolton.
It's unbelievable that people still believe in that narrative.
Yes.
But can you talk a little bit about that? What's the deal with that? Why is he, how do people still believe this kind of narrative on him?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Donald Trump made some very significant mistakes in his dealings with the intelligence community. But I'll back up. I'll back up to the period just after he won the election in 2016 and before he took office. I was asked by CNN to go talk about a comment that Chuck Schumer had made, Chuck Schumer being the Senate Majority Leader. So Trump was talking about draining the swamp and the CIA is out of control. It's a rogue organization, all of which is great. I was with him on those issues. And then Chuck Schumer said, that's not the way it works. They can make your job harder than you can even imagine. He said they have 9 ways from Sunday, was the term he used, to make your job impossible. So CNN wanted me to go on and explain what that meant. And I said, okay, first of all, let's say what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean a repeat of November 22nd, 1963. That's not what Schumer was talking about. What Schumer's talking about is this: presidents come and go every 4 years or every 8 years, but CIA leaders are there for 25, 30, 35 years, sometimes longer. They're not going anywhere, and no president's going to push them out. And they know that no matter who the president is, if they don't like that guy, they can outweight him. So you go to the White House and the president says, I want you to do A, B, and C. You say, yes, sir, Mr. President. You go back and you say, fuck you. And you do nothing. That's what they do. If there's one thing that the CIA loves, it's a newly elected president with no experience in intelligence. Now, Trump was the exception, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But look at Obama. Obama was in the Senate for 2 years. He was utterly unqualified to be president. Whether you like the way things turned out or not, the man was unqualified to be president. And so the rule is the day after the election, the president-elect gets his first day of CIA briefings. It's called the PDB briefing, the President's Daily Brief.
Okay.
Once that guy sees his first blue border report or black border report, 6 levels above top secret, and his briefer says, Mr. President-elect, just wait until you hear the cool things we're doing all over the world. They've hooked him. They've hooked him and they brought him in, and he's one of the gang now. Now, Trump wasn't like that. And so they decided they could disrupt him. I wondered if he thought he could get around that by naming Gina Haspel, who was the consummate insider, the godmother of the CIA's torture program. He named her as CIA director. The morning that she was named, I got a call from the Washington Post, and they said, can you write an op-ed on Gina Haspel? We'll hold it for the Sunday edition. They have like 5 times the circulation on Sunday that they do during the week. I said, absolutely. And they gave me an unlimited number of words, which is highly unusual. So I had like the whole, it's called the Outlook section in the Washington Post for that Sunday. As soon as it's published, I get a call from Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky. And he says, can you come up here and help us strategize about how to block this woman's nomination? I said, I'll be right there. I jump in the car. I go up to Rand Paul's office on Capitol Hill. He's got this whiteboard. We're writing ideas on the whiteboard. A week later, he voted yes to confirm her. That's Washington. The CIA's in charge here. Donald Trump's not in charge. Rand Paul's not going to throw a wrench into the works. The intelligence community, the deep state, and you don't have to call it the deep state. You could just call it the federal bureaucracy if you want. They're the ones in charge because they're not going anywhere.
Yeah, that word, kind of the deep state, that phrase is almost kind of tainted at this point, or it gets that response that, other things, like during the JFK, when the CIA pretty much created the term conspiracy theorist, to discredit people who didn't believe in this lone nut theory or whatever. It seems like there's always, I doubt that Trump was one of them, but it seems like there have to be kind of wild cards every now and then, kind of rogue people. And, hearkening back to what we've talked about a few times here already, it seems like one of their main methods for dealing with those instances is blackmail of some sort, whether it's sexual or that tends to be the main MO is sexual blackmail.
I would disagree if you let me interrupt.
No, please.
I was taught when I first entered CIA operational training, I was taught that blackmail is the last resort because you don't want your relationship to be one of distrust or resentment. If you can convince the person to do whatever it is you want him to do because you're his best friend, or absent that, you're paying him ridiculous amounts of money or giving him whatever else he wants. In the Middle East, it's porn or pork. I had a station chief who said he could recruit a Saudi with a pound of bacon. You just never know. If none of that works and you have something that you can hold over this guy's head, then that's when blackmail comes in. The Russians use blackmail a lot, and so do the Iranians.
Mm-hmm.
But we try not to,
Mm-hmm.
unless we have to.
Kind of as a last resort, but that nonetheless, that apparatus
Nonetheless, that's right.
does exist there,
Yes.
when it needs to be procured. Do you know much about this guy, Roy Cohen? He was kind of this very famous McCarthy era lawyer and also one of Trump's mentors.
Oh, yeah.
What was his deal with the whole blackmailing ring and J. Edgar Hoover? What can you tell us about that?
Wow,
I know there's been a lot written, but
wow, yeah. Oh, there have been movies made even. Roy Cohen was one of the darkest, ugliest figures in modern American history.
Mm-hmm.
Roy Cohen, he was also a notorious gay man in a period where he was the one in charge of ruining the lives of gay men.
Mm-hmm.
So he was, as out as you could be in the early and mid 1950s, mm-hmm. but he was very, very close to J. Edgar Hoover, who was also a gay man,
okay.
A deeply closeted gay man, and to Senator Joseph McCarthy, the junior Republican from Wisconsin, where we get the word McCarthyism.
Yeah.
So the thing about Cohen was he was virulently anti-communist. If you weren't a right-wing Republican, you were a communist. And as a communist, you were an enemy of the state and you had to be dealt with. Locked up, preferably, if not locked up, ruined professionally. Mm-hmm. And he ruined the lives of countless people, whether it was Hollywood writers or directors, journalists, other politicians. There was a famous story where there was a Democratic politician in the House of Representatives whose vote they wanted on the FBI budget, and he was going to vote against the FBI budget. Well, this guy had an affair, and so they blackmailed him, and they said, we're going to hold this over your head, and go public. We're going to not just tell your wife that you cheated on her, we're going to tell the papers in your district. Well, as a matter of principle, he said, I'm not afraid of you. And so they told his wife, and they released the information to the press. And so he decided that every day between the election and the swearing in of the new Congress, he was going to give a speech on the floor of the House saying that J. Edgar Hoover and the deputy FBI director, Clyde Tolson, his words, live as man and wife. Wow. Yeah, in Hoover's home, which was true. They actually owned houses next door to each other, but they actually lived in mm-hmm. Hoover's house. Mm-hmm. And that they had sexual relations with Roy Cohen. Wow. And so that's what he did. Now, this was 1953, 54, mm-hmm. but he was ruined. He was the only one who ever fought back. Well, mm-hmm. Cohen learned lessons. Remember, Cohen was in his 20s at the time. And so he learned lessons from the likes of Joe McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover, and he carried those lessons into business and connected with Donald Trump in the 1970s. And was a mentor, an advisor, and an attorney to Trump. And many, many people say that it was Cohen rather, that taught Trump that ruthlessness that we see today. Now, yeah. Cohen ended up dying of AIDS in the 1980s, alone, unloved, no family, and was buried in the family vault of a family friend that took pity on him, because nobody even bothered to go to his funeral. But I mean, here we are 40 years later, and the lessons of Roy Cohen are still being played out every day in the campaign of Donald Trump.
All that is pretty fascinating that you told us about Roy Cohen, and I didn't actually know that he died of AIDS.
Yeah.
But that reminds me also, I know I've heard you talking about some other things with J. Edgar Hoover, the Plaza Hotel, and some of these
Yeah.
other kind of blackmail locations. To me, one of the most interesting one is the Khashoggi brothers and Adnan Khashoggi's. You said he had a boat that was kind of famous for blackmail procurement back in the day.
Yeah, that's why we went to Adnan Khashoggi when we wanted to transfer arms to the Iranians in
Hmm.
exchange for the money then being transferred to the Contras
Hmm.
in Nicaragua.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, what do you know about the Roy Raden murders and Robert? Have you heard of those at all?
No, sorry.
Adnan Khashoggi was kind of tangentially involved in these murders, and they basically involved a high level of like trafficking, and there were these movie producers in New York in like the 50s and 60s, and drug trafficking, human trafficking, things like that. But there's a lot of parallels kind of in that case with other ones like the Son of Sam murders that were kind of simultaneous, and then Charles Manson, which we now, at least to some degree, have quite a bit of evidence that Charles Manson and that whole scene that was going on there in Los Angeles was pretty directly related to the CIA's mind control programs and MK Ultra, the LSD
Yes.
research and Jolly West and things like that. Um, I've also just noticed that this theme of blackmail pops up a lot in those circles,
Yes.
even with Charles Manson, it was found out that the prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, was hiding videotapes that they found at the Tate house of Sharon Tate being raped by multiple different people. Um, so do you have any kind of theory as to why that theme would pop up so frequently in these high profile murder cases that also have this, kind of spooky overlap with intelligence?
Well, I think that MK Ultra, the CIA mind control program,
Hmm.
was far deeper
Yes.
than people realize. And it wasn't just MK Ultra. There were sub operations of MK Ultra,
Right.
MK Pickwick, for example, it,
Artichoke.
MK Artichoke.
Hmm.
It started off actually before the CIA was even created. The the Office of Strategic Services convinced President Truman to allow them to recruit Nazi scientists to bring
Right.
them to the United States. Now, every American knows that many of these Nazi scientists ended up creating what we know today as NASA.
Hmm.
Right? It
Hmm.
was these German scientists that got us to the moon, for example. What most Americans don't know is it wasn't just rocket scientists that we brought here. It was scientists who had worked in the concentration camps, experimenting on mind control. And the Nazis had convinced themselves in the early 1940s that it was possible to brainwash a person to the point where he would carry out any operation you instructed him to carry out and would have no ability to resist and then no memory of it once it was done.
Hmm.
So the CIA decided, when the CIA was created in 1947 with passage of the National Security Act, the CIA decided that this was something that they wanted to continue experimenting on. They did that at Fort Detrick, Maryland.
Hmm.
Everybody thinks Fort Detrick was just for explosives research. That's where the mind control research was being conducted at the same time. There was this perfect storm that you've got the Nazis coming over, the creation of the CIA, the appointment of Fort Detrick as the place where experimentation can take place, and the invention in Switzerland of LSD.
Hmm.
So it all came together, and the CIA thought, oh my God, this new lysergic diethylamine 25 or whatever it's called,
Hmm.
um, this is like a miracle for us for mind control. And so they just started dosing people without even telling them they were being dosed, to the point where they killed a bunch of people, including several CIA officers, several enlisted men in the U.S. military.
Right.
Uh, and then they decided, well, rather than experiment on our own people, we're going to do it in a couple different ways.
Hmm.
And they ended up going to San Francisco and buying a house there that they used as a safe house, a CIA safe house, to be used in the MK Ultra experiments.
Right.
And they recruited a group of prostitutes to go out on the streets, get their Johns, bring the Johns back to the safe house, dose them with LSD, and then see if they were pliable and whether or not they remembered anything at the end of it.
And what you're talking about is Operation Midnight Climax, correct?
Correct.
With George Hunter White.
That's exactly right. Okay. Those experiments didn't work. They believed at the time that they had learned a lot, but they couldn't actually get to the point where they could control people. So then they did it in France. Now, this was only revealed in the late 1990s. They decided to dose the delivery of rye wheat in a baker's shop in a village. Okay, he made the morning bread for the whole village. It's several hundred, 500 people, whatever it was in the village. Everybody goes on a trip, right? A couple of people died. And scientists studied this for years, and they said, well, it looks like there was mold in the rye, and the mold is akin to the kind of mold on magic mushrooms. And it was only in the late 1990s that they realized, no, this was likely a CIA MK Ultra LSD experiment.
Right.
That didn't work. And so they decided in the 1960s to go to universities, beginning with Harvard University. This is where Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was dosed.
Well, he was actually a confirmed participant in MK Ultra trial. He signed up, and some people speculate that it might have broken.
Yes. Yeah. They signed contracts and everything, thinking, well, we're going to run into legal problems if people realize, if the government realizes we're just doing this out, in the open. There was one terrible experiment where they decided to just blow it into the fog in New York Harbor.
Like an aerosol delivery?
Like an aerosol, kind of just to see what would happen. And what ended up happening was 11 people went to the doctor with this very rare strain of urinary tract infection. And the CIA was able to confirm, yeah, that was us, but it didn't brainwash them or make them pliable. It just gave them a urinary tract infection. So that didn't work. That's when they decided to go to the universities, make it official, draw up a contract. The students sign the contract. The CIA doses them, tries to control their minds. That didn't work. Now, this went all the way from 1945 until the Church Committee in 1975.
Yeah.
Countless people dead, countless people mentally ruined, and the CIA never paid any price for it.
A couple other interesting things that I think, like you said, that people don't know about it. When it was synthesized by Albert Hofmann in Switzerland, the company that he was working for, Sandoz, I believe that the LSD research was being funded kind of, on the down low by the CIA through this massive German conglomerate called IG Farben. And
I'm sure that's true.
And they famously, made the
Zyklon B.
The Zyklon B gas. Yeah. Another weird connection with that and with Nazi Germany is that one of the most infamous and, infamously cruel of the MK Ultra doctors was this guy, Dr. Ewan Cameron, who worked out of a hospital in Montreal in Canada.
Yes.
And he was very famous for his just exceedingly cruel experimentation. But he was actually, I just learned this recently, that he was actually one of the key people during the Nuremberg trials that kind of brought to light Joseph Mengele's experiments. So you have somebody that works directly, for the CIA under CIA funding, doing very similar types of, human experimentation, and also being the one to, kind of expose the Nazi atrocities and, what Mengele was doing. So that kind of blew my mind when I found that out.
It really does boggle the mind. Just incredible.
Where maybe me and you might disagree a little bit on the MK Ultra, officially on paper, it ended in 1974, right? That's kind of, And, like you said, a lot of the early experimentation with the drugs and LSD kind of failed, or at
Yeah.
least it didn't give them the ability to just, directly go in and control a person against their will that they might have wanted. What I kind of believe was, more the hidden aspect of MK Ultra, or the real goal was not necessarily to just create these programmed assassins or couriers. That's what they were willing to tell us with the church committee and movies and Manchurian Candidate and stuff like that. To me, that's very much the surface narrative of MK Ultra.
Yeah.
I think what a pretty commonly accepted view of it at this point is that it was more of a social engineering kind of project, introducing these drugs at the same time that a lot of different popular culture was being introduced, the hippie scene in Laurel Canyon and these things that we now know were a little bit more manufactured than they were organic.
Right.
So, or the Grateful Dead, I mean, that one
Yeah,
is
sure.
pretty much we know at this point, that they were a LSD trafficking ring, with extremely abundant ties to intelligence.
Uh-huh.
But it seems I feel like MK Ultra more than anything was probably a way to subvert or divert, legitimate counterculture or legitimate anti-war
Oh,
protest.
you get no argument from me. I
Hmm.
could absolutely see that.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Just think of how much of a threat J. Edgar Hoover thought
Of course.
counterculture was. It had to be worse than the CIA at the time.
Yeah. So it only makes sense that they would want to either co-opt it or neutralize it from the
Mm-hmm.
ground up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know that there's lots of books written on this, and I've read articles, talking about intelligence agencies working with Hollywood on, war movies and different things where they want to make sure they're portraying this
Yes.
very, doctored version of the CIA
Yes.
for, public consumption. Do you think that A, can you tell us anything that you know about that from
Sure.
firsthand? And B, also, what do you think about, I don't know if you're familiar with David McGowan and his books about the music industry and kind of the overlap
Ah,
there. He wrote a book
no.
about like Laurel Canyon in California in the 60s, and that almost without fail, almost every one of those very famous stars, Zappa or Jim Morrison or whoever, that almost all of them came from families of, military intelligence backgrounds.
Yeah, that's true.
Hmm.
That is true.
Hmm.
I can tell you that the CIA in the last 20 years created a branch inside the Office of Public Affairs whose job it is solely, strictly to cooperate with Hollywood film studios.
Hmm.
This is something that the FBI has been doing since the early 50s, where no studio even had the guts to even pitch a show about the FBI unless it had the approval of J. Edgar Hoover.
Hmm.
That's why we only had pro FBI TV shows and films in that whole period. Well, the same is true now at the CIA. Like, for example, just one example, Zero Dark 30.
Yeah.
Zero Dark 30 perpetuated that lie that the torture program led to the killing of Osama bin Laden. Absolutely 100% not true.
Hmm.
Great analysis led to the killing of Osama bin Laden. So the CIA belatedly learned a lesson from the FBI that if you want to influence Hollywood, you wine them and dine them. Again, let's look at Zero Dark 30. In violation of federal law, the acting director of the CIA, Mike Morrell, and other senior intelligence service officials gave Catherine Bigelow, the director and producer, and Mark Bowl, the writer, classified briefings over a classified mock-up of the bin Laden compound. They gave them classified briefings from analysts in the CIA's counterterrorism center. And then when the film was made, also in violation of federal law, Bigelow and Bowl gave those analysts that had provided the briefings tickets to the premiere in Westwood the night the movie came out. And for those analysts who couldn't make it, they gave them watches. it's a felony to
Mhm.
do something like that
Mhm.
on both sides.
Right, right. What business does a Hollywood director have being debriefed on classified material, you
Yeah.
know?
And I'll tell you something else. I was sitting in my office one time, and I've said this publicly in the past, but it bears repeating.
Mhm.
Sitting in my office, I was the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations. So it's a pretty big job, important job.
Yeah.
And I had just finished something, and I sat back like this at my desk, and I had a direct line of sight out to the hall, past the secretary. And Bob Woodward walks down the hall. And I said to the secretary, "Was that Bob Woodward that just walked past the office?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Bob Woodward, walk in the halls without an escort, like he owns the place." And she said, "Oh, you didn't see the director's memo?" And I said, "No." She said, He's writing a book, and we're all ordered to cooperate with him." I said, "What the fuck is going on now? Everything's supposed to be classified. We got a Washington Post reporter walking the halls, and we're supposed to just open up to him. I'm not talking to Bob Woodward." But that's how it is now.
Wow, that's unbelievable. Last question on this kind of MK Ultra and that type of things. Do you believe that it's true that it was a failed experiment and that they discontinued it, or do you believe that it still persists in different manifestations today?
I think the answer is kind of yes and no.
Hmm.
I believe it failed.
Hmm.
It failed because, at least internally, the stated goal was to try to direct it against the Russians and the Chinese,
Right,
and they were never able to do that.
right.
No, in that, I mean, does anything really end
Hmm.
at the CIA, or does one experiment build on the last experiment? The CIA
Hmm.
has four directorates: operations, intelligence, science and technology, and administration. And then there are others like, security and whatever,
Okay.
that report directly to the director. But who knows what goes on in the science and technology directorate? They're always doing crazy experiments that don't come out for 30 and 40 and 50 years.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't bet money on
Hmm.
the fact that experiments akin to what we saw in MK Ultra are not being carried out today.
Hmm. What you said about, does anything ever really end with the CIA? It reminded me, and I'm sure you've heard this saying too, something like once CIA, always CIA,
Oh,
you
I hate
know.
that so much.
What do you, I know even on videos of you,
Oh,
you've done podcasts with this other CIA guy that Andrew Bustamante,
yeah.
and I don't know if you look at comments or things on videos, but I consistently see people saying things like, "Oh, this guy glows," or they say he's ex-CIA, but there's no such
Yeah.
thing. What do you is that, what do you make of that kind of line of thinking?
I think that's very intellectually lazy.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, People think I'm still CIA. I went to prison for my
Right.
beliefs. They think Ed Snowden is CIA, or
Hmm.
Philip Agee, who the CIA hunted all over the world to try
Yeah.
to assassinate for 30 years, or Ray McGovern, who has repeatedly gotten arrested protesting the CIA. It's
Yeah.
just so intellectually lazy.
Hmm.
Just because you might disagree with somebody who says like one thing that's not in your personal belief. Oh,
Yeah.
once CIA, always CIA. No, you're just too stupid to do the research and to come to a real analytic decision.
Yeah.
Now, Andrew Bustamante, I knew I had won that debate when he attacked me personally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but one of the things that I wish I had said when he said, "Oh, well, you've worked for the Russians and you have a Russian propaganda show."
Hmm.
No, no,
Hmm.
I don't. But how is it different for me to do a radio show and for you to sell for $3,000 and $4,000, depending on the course you want? He sells courses in the training that the CIA gave him.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's
Yeah,
rather
that's how he makes
hypocritical.
that's how he makes a living.
Wow.
So, what's to keep the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians, the Cubans, or the Israelis, for that matter, from just plunking down the $3,000 and taking his CIA secrets?
Or
So
his course, what
hypocritical.
he sells is not legitimately what he says it is, and then that just makes
Right.
him a grifter, or a
Well,
liar.
and speaking of grifting and lying, I was an operations officer. I was a case officer. I was recruiting spies to steal secrets and
Mm-hmm.
infiltrate groups. It was dangerous. It was exciting. It's what you see in the movies.
Mm-hmm.
He was what is called a special operations officer. They do surveillance, they do the paperwork, they go pick up my dry cleaning. He never recruited anybody in his life.
Hmm.
It wasn't his job.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Does he can't remember if he claims that he's not with the CIA, or is he employed
No,
by the CIA right
he
now?
claims that he's an independent actor now.
Okay.
He never explained why he left the CIA after only 7 years. If you're such a high flying, shooting straight to the top cowboy,
Mm-hmm.
why would you leave after 7 years?
Mm-hmm.
If you love the place so much that you want to go on podcasts and fight,
Defend it.
yeah, right. Why would you leave?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Maybe I'll ask him that someday. We'll see. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. I know we're coming up on an hour. There were a couple other little things I wanted to get into, but they might take a little bit too much time. There was one more question, if you don't mind me asking you. I had heard you reference in another podcast or a conversation you were having that you were trying to do a piece. You were writing a piece on a popular science fiction author from the 50s who you thought may have worked for the NSA or the CIA, and
That's
you were
right.
kind of blocked on your FOIA requests and whatever else you were trying to do. I had a couple guesses of who that was, but I wanted to know if you could tell us who that author was.
Oh,
Pension or Heinlein or something.
I don't remember, to tell you the truth. He had a funny name. You know what? Let me see if I can find it.
My guess would have been either Robert Heinlein or Thomas Pynchon.
No.
Those two, I know people speculate that they had some sort of insider.
This guy committed suicide in 1958.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry that I don't remember his name. I did it as a favor to a friend of mine in LA who wanted to write a screenplay. And I said, "Oh, I'll do it." It takes about a minute to fill out a FOIA request.
Yeah.
Well, that was 9 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's going to be another 20 years before I ever get a response.
It just caught my ears because I'm very interested in that overlap of, science fiction and intelligence and NASA and stuff. I'm sure you're aware of, Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard and all this, all this craziness that was going on back then. So that's
the word.
Yes,
that's the word. Craziness.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, hey, maybe we'll get to do this another time and dig in a little deeper to some more things. But yeah, I really appreciate you joining me today, John.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Good to talk to you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.